Hello everybody, Pastor Phil, Door of Hope Church here in Maryborough. I'm about to show you a clip of some extended preaching I did last Saturday. For those of you who aren't part of the church, if you just fast forward to where you see me standing on the stage behind the pulpit, that's where I start to do the talking, where I extend my talk about the humanity of Jesus Christ and what it means for him to be fully human and how that relates to our nature as humans as well. It's more extensive talk. But for the people here at Door of Hope, the reason I've done this video is to start to help people understand the difference that will come into play between Saturday morning's preaching and Sunday morning's preaching. Once we eventually get back to being able to have a full crowd or near enough to a full crowd on Sunday, probably, my guess is that it would need to be more than 50, probably need to get up to around 70 or 80, maximise the space on Sunday mornings. Once that happens, I will start preaching a different sermon on Saturday morning to the one I preach on Sunday morning. Saturday mornings will become more in depth, and once I can do that, that will provide a place for those who have been in Christianity longer and would like to go further in their knowledge, in their walk and faith with Christ, can join us on Saturday morning to do that. And then I will start to lighten, so to speak, or reduce the amount of technical theology in Sunday mornings and pitch it more at a younger Christian level so that people can grow in their faith at that point. Because I have too vast a range of people in the congregation, people who have studied theology right down to people who are not yet saved, and to be able to preach to those two ends is impossible really. So this will cater to the different needs within the church. But in preparation for that, I would encourage those people who watch the video following this and you think that's the level of thought and interaction and involvement I'd like, then I would encourage you to consider coming to the Saturday morning services. The Saturday morning services will always have praise and worship and communion and enough fellowship and Bible study in it that it would fulfill your requirement to set aside a day for the Lord. There wouldn't be a need for you to have to attend church on Sunday. The idea that we have to attend church on Sunday is not really biblically founded. For Christians, we worship the Lord every day, and as often as we meet together, we share communion. But at a minimum, a day a week, and that can be any day, and in some ways, Saturday being the Sabbath is probably a more biblical day anyhow. So don't be concerned that Sunday is some sort of special day that you need to meet if you feel that Saturday is more suitable. And one of my first or early talks will be about that very issue, about the Sabbath and how the church changed its meeting day from Saturday to Sunday and how that all came about. But hope you enjoy the following footage and let it be an encouragement to all those who watch that Jesus really is an amazing historical figure. The incarnation, that Jesus was able to resist sin and have the same nature as us, is just the miracle of the incarnation and joy. So we're going to go back and look at something that impinges on some of the doctrine that I've been sharing, which is total depravity. And you've noticed that in the talk I said that Jesus was fully human like us. Now the question is, how fully human? And this is what a lot of people mix up in their mind. And I, for a long time as a young Christian, even though I heard the expression Jesus sympathize and can, it doesn't say empathize, I've got to remember to stop saying that. Jesus can sympathize with your temptation, with your suffering and with your weakness. And in my mind as a young Christian, I went, yes, but I couldn't really accept it because I knew my own life and I knew the life of everybody, that all sin. So how can he genuinely sympathize with our fallenness and not sin? Because then that, in your mind, you start to say he's somehow different than us.
And that difference that you attribute to him, in our human nature, most people tend to change his humanity from something different to us. That he was like us, but he was not really like us. So the conundrum or the problem is, how can Jesus be actually like us and not sin? And it then has a severe... Oh, I moved tonight, sorry. I'll try and stay still. That's going to be real difficult. The problem is, if he is fully like us, all of us would say that we have a fallen nature. So the question is, did Jesus have a fallen nature? No, don't be too quick to say no, because if you say he didn't have a fallen nature, if we look at the verse, because it's going to go back to the way you understand fallen nature, all right? So we're going to it like another level here. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but in all points was tempted as we are." Now, and the other verse that was back at the start too, I think it's Hebrews 2:14, which says that he is of the same nature. So Scripture says he is of the same nature and tempted in all things as we are. So the Scripture is teaching that Jesus is the same as we are. Now, when you're a young Christian, and for a lot of people, and this is why I'm going to another level, like to really sort this out, because most people then say, he is not like us, he's somehow different than us. And as soon as you say he's different than us, he cannot sympathise or be fully identified with us. That's the problem. And we always fall into this trap. Now, this also then hinges off your understanding of the fallen nature or total depravity. Because if our fallen nature means that we are born with guilt, then Jesus was born guilty. See, before he had a chance to resist sin and temptation. But if the Scripture teaches that he was exactly like us, of the same nature, and the word it literally says of the same nature. So Scripture doesn't teach that he was of a different nature, he was of the same nature. And it then says that he was tempted and tested in all things as we are, so that he could sympathize with us. He is 100% human. He is not different than us. The problem then comes down to your understanding of the sin nature that we inherit from Adam and what that actually is. Because what happened in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, they understood that this, and there was complete unity apparently. I've just been listening to a professor who read all the early church fathers' writings and figured out where the problem came. It came in about the 4th century. So the first 3 centuries, the church was in absolute common union in its understanding of this issue. It wasn't until Arianism, about the 4th century, where a philosopher was a priest or a theologian as well. He was a theologian and a philosopher, and he started to philosophize about this problem, and he attributed, and that's where the idea of total depravity being connected to guilt came, in about the 4th century. Prior to that, Christians didn't believe that a child was born with guilt. So therefore, the conundrum or the problem is this issue: if a child is born, and a child is born guilty of Adam's sin, so therefore, if that child was to be judged by God at that point in time, he'd be found guilty because he has an inherited sin nature. So an inherited sin nature doesn't mean he's guilty of sin. Because if he's guilty of sin, if this baby is guilty of sin, the baby is guilty of someone else's sin. He's guilty of his father's sin, his mother's sin, or Adam's sin. And that is unjust. We know that's unjust. And the early church never had a concept that a baby was born guilty. But they did have a concept that a baby was born with the sin nature. See, so that's the difference, and it's an important difference, because that means Jesus can be born with our sin nature and not guilty. Right? So this means he is fully like us. So just sort of, when you start to grasp it, blows my mind, because then I realise that the very things that I fall into daily, he obediently resisted, humbly obeyed the Father. Remember last week I talked about pride and rebellion. He had the same nature, which means we have the same nature, which then goes back to that comment I made, did Jesus need to come into the world if it's possible for us not to sin? I would say yes, because of the foreknowledge of God being the Alpha and the Omega. He knew that all men would sin. So I set people up here a little bit. We're going to the next level. No, because we are capable of not sinning, but we are not capable of it because God knows that all of us have and all of us will by his omniscience, his eternal knowledge, his eternal presence. He knows that all men everywhere have sinned. Some theologians question whether Enoch didn't sin because Enoch went to be with the Lord bodily. Well, we're going to leave that alone, Enoch. But this comes down to Jesus. The point is, and look, I know I'm stirring your thinking. If you've got questions or thoughts at the end of it, Jesus had to have been the same substance as us, so therefore he inherited our nature. That nature does not make us guilty. What makes us guilty is at some point in time we choose to sin. So that means Jesus at some point in time chose not to sin and continued to choose not to sin. Now, the reason we have so much trouble with this is we cannot relate to that. We continually sin. And then we look at the people around us and we see the people around us, they're choosing to continually sin. And we all struggle with sin. And then we turn around and say, Jesus Christ had the exact same nature. His nature was not different. So therefore, he was born with a sin nature. The problem with saying sin nature is what people confuse is that word sin. Because sin nature doesn't mean you have sin, it means you have the ability to sin. And that's important to understand that difference. That when Adam and Eve were at the garden and were innocent, so they chose to take the fruit, we'll get into that one day, whether it was actual fruit or what. But whatever they did, they disobeyed God. They chose to disobey God. And in their innocence, they chose to disobey God. But what came into the world then was the knowledge of good and evil. So we have the knowledge of good and evil. Now, don't turn Jesus into like Adam before the fall. Because Adam before the fall did not have a knowledge of good and evil. He was innocent. Jesus was not innocent in that sense, because Jesus has to be able to determine in his life what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is evil, what's the Father's will and what's the will of the devil. So therefore in his flesh and in his humanity, he had to be different than the original Adam in his innocent state, or else he could not choose to do the right thing. He could not by experience learn obedience. The only way he could learn obedience is if he had the ability to know that is right and that is wrong, which means he has our fallen nature. Okay? But his fallen nature does not make him guilty, because you don't inherit guilt from your parents, and you don't inherit guilt from Adam. We inherit a fallen nature. That fallen nature is knowledge of good and evil without the glory and power and holiness of God. Because the other thing about that is that at the fall, Satan didn't lie. I think I've preached this before, but it'll come around again. Satan didn't lie. When you eat of that, you shall become like him. And he was telling the truth. They did. They became like God, knowing good from evil. Yeah. See, so if we think of our fallen nature as something ungodly, that's not right. Our fallen nature is actually more like God, in that God knows good from evil. So we sinned and now know good from evil. So that fallen nature of Jesus Christ into the world is not a sin. It's not sin, it's not guilt. It's the ability in a fully human form to identify the difference between good and evil, but he chose to do right according to the will of the Father. Okay? Is there any thought? Have I stunned you or do you need to process that? You can turn it off, love. Because you want to get this on tape. Because this is, a hardline Calvinist, because you drift. Like when you study, you go a bit this way and you go a bit that way. I became a hardline Calvinist, which was that we are born with a depraved nature, and you've heard me teach about total depravity. I went too far in thinking that total depravity was a fallen, not a fallen nature, a guilt. That there is no, because if a baby is guilty, then Jesus is born with guilt. Or he's not like us. So I've worked myself to the point, and Kerry's really happy because she's disagreed with me for decades. I used to believe that babies would go to hell if they died. Because if you're born with guilt, then you're found guilty, you would go to hell. And so I'm brutal enough as a guy to just suck it up. But now I have a theological reason to say no, babies are born innocent, and if their baby dies, goes to heaven. But now the next conundrum is, at what point does a baby choose? The year of yeah. Yeah, that's probably debatable, because I was thinking the first time the baby goes, I'd really love to go back and
the baby doesn't know it's done.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have gone like this. I'm shifting into I'm stirring you. So the question is, at what stage does a person become accountable for their actions? At what point do they know that they're choosing evil? And at that same point is where Jesus chose evil. Okay, that do?
That's